Hey, this is Chris with CKR, and I'm going to be telling you today about my span panel and my solar system. I just wanted to point out here, you can see I have a utility meter like everybody else. And the old way of telling whether your solar system was producing power or not was there's actually some little dots here that go to the right when you're buying power, and they actually go to the left when you're selling power. In the real olden days, that this meter actually used to spin, and you could watch it spin one way or the other. That's now replaced with these little dots here that give you a visual representation of whether you're importing or exporting power. Generally, you put your solar panels on your roof, and they're going to produce power, and that excess is going to go out to the utility grid. Well, a lot has changed since those days of not being able to see what you're producing or what you're consuming. I also have a Tesla gateway here. This is the gateway 2, and that's to help my power walls function. So my meter is fed into my gateway, and then my gateway feeds my span panel. My span panel manages my batteries. Come, I'll show you more. You'll have to excuse the mess, especially between the seasons of Halloween and Christmas. All right, so here's my span panel. As you can see, it's sort of at its very basic, just a regular panel. It's got your breakers in here. It does have a nice LED light that lights up so you can see what's going on. And at its heart, it's just a main panel, right? So you've got your main disconnect, and then you have your breakers in here. But what's happening is it also is the brains of the entire operation. So the span panel, let's say the grid goes out, we're without power, it's going to automatically shed some of my heavier loads. So my water heater, for example, that will turn off automatically, as will a few other heavier loads, such as my dryer, my oven, and that all happens automatically. It'll then switch the batteries to nice to have mode. And those are the things like my air conditioner, where it's nice to have them. The power's out for a few hours, right? I can run my AC, nothing, no real change in my lifestyle. Once my batteries get to below 50%, it's going to shut those nice to have loads off. And it's just going to go to the critical loads. So those are my fridge, my freezer, my security system, some lights, and my internet. And those are going to remain backed up. Obviously, the loads are much smaller, and so the batteries will last right through the night. The idea being is the span is managing all these loads in real time so that I don't have to come out here and start flipping breakers myself, right? The worst thing that can happen is you lose power when you're not home. Perhaps you're on vacation. All your heavy loads kick in, and it drains your batteries to a point where they can no longer recharge, because that does happen. If you use too much power and you drain your batteries too much, they may not come back on. And so span manages all those loads automatically. So you don't actually have to be a rocket scientist to figure out, hey, what do I need to leave on? What do I need to turn off? Because the span's doing that for you. And it's then giving you more battery overall, right? It's going to maintain those batteries for longer, with the idea being that it will carry you through the night. The sun comes back on. The sun comes back on. It doesn't come back on. It just rises. Well, the sun rises, solar kicks back in, recharges your batteries, and then you get to a state where your heavier loads could come back on. You're going to get a longer battery life, and again, you don't need to be managing that manually. So much simpler, and it's especially good for snowbirds, people who travel a lot, because the last thing you want is to be worried about what you have running while you're away on vacation, so on and so forth. Also integrated with my span panel is the span drive. So this is a level 2 EV charger, which works in conjunction with the span panel, and it'll actually give you more power in real time for your EV. Essentially, it can tell whether loads are being used within the home, and if they're not, it'll drive more power towards charging the car. Super efficient, goes hand in hand. You get the one single app where you can manage your solar, batteries, and EV all through the span architecture. It's pretty phenomenal. Now, one thing I always get asked is, well, why should I make this investment? I've got a main panel, it's working fine. Look, no two ways about it, span is expensive. I've had mine for about 3 years, and it's probably the best investment I've ever made. During the last hurricane, we had to evacuate. We ended up in Pensacola. Funny story about that for another time, but basically turned a hurricane evacuation into a family vacation. Obviously, the power went out all throughout the Tampa Bay area. I was able to manage my home remotely, you know, while I was there. So it was really cool. Like, hey, I want the ACs to kick in now, so I could bring the humidity down, and I was able to manage all of my loads within my home. Whereas my other family members, not having a span panel, kind of just had to wait, watch their security cameras and see whether they had power or not. So really awesome in those circumstances, right? No one wants to evacuate for a hurricane. No one wants a power outage. But ultimately, when they do happen, right, you're more secure in the knowledge of what you can do. Now, it costs more than a regular panel. That's for sure. I mean, these things are incredible. A lot goes into them. You know, more often than not, breakers need to be swapped out. But that investment is worth making, especially if you're putting solar in, and definitely when you put batteries in. And the reason being is because the actual cost of the span compared to, say, another battery isn't it's not as expensive, right? So you can get one span panel and one battery for the price of less than two batteries. But that span panel is going to give you the functionality as if you had two batteries. It's adding to your capacity. So the overall cost isn't as great, but ultimately it's going to give you way more control. A lot of folks install, a couple of batteries and they think, hey, I'm just going to be able to, run my house as I usually do. That's not the case. You start turning on air conditioners, your oven, your water heater, all those things kick on. It can be too much for those batteries to handle. Or in the case of the newer batteries, they may be able to turn on, but they might not be able to run for as long. And so with the span panel, you're managing all of those loads. So your battery capacity is actually greater, but also um, what happens is, you don't have to worry about turning things on and off yourself. So often installers will just say, hey, yeah, a couple of batteries, that'll run your whole home, not really being clear about what it is you have to manage when you're on battery power. And it does take some management. Some installers install what's called a critical loads panel, which is basically a small panel, that is just being run by your batteries. Well, the problem with that is in the future, if you go to add additional storage capacity, you're stuck with that small panel. There's also a labor cost of installing a critical loads panel. So ultimately with span, you're saving on having to install additional battery capacity, but you're also saving on having to install additional infrastructure, such as a critical loads panel, which, if you're talking to a good solar installer or battery installer, that's what they should be doing. We always recommend a span panel with each and every battery system because ultimately it is well worth the investment. And you're only making this investment once, so why not do it right the first time?